Our first reading is from 1 Kings chapter 18, verses 20 through 29. On Mount Carmel, Elijah confronts the prophets of Baal. So Ahab sent to all the Israelites and assembled the prophets at Mount Carmel. Elijah then came near to all the people and said, "How long will you go limping with two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him." The people did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said to the people, "I, even I only, am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets number 450. Let 2 bulls be given to us. Let them choose 1 bull for themselves, cut it in pieces, and lay it on the wood, but put no fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood, but put no fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire is indeed God." All the people answered, "Well spoken." Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose for yourselves 1 bull and prepare it first, for you are many. Then call on the name of your God, but put no fire to it." So they took the bull that was given them, prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, crying, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no voice and no answer. They limped about the altar that they had made. At noon, Elijah mocked them, saying, "Cry aloud. Surely he is a god. Either he is meditating, or he has wandered away, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened." Then they cried aloud, and as was their custom, they cut themselves with swords and lances until the blood gushed out over them. As midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation. But there was no voice, no answer, and no response. Our second reading is 1 Kings chapter 18, verses 30 through 39. The story continues after the prophets of Baal had no response from their God. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come closer to me." and all the people came closer to him. First he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, Israel shall be your name. With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord. Then he made a trench around the altar, large enough to contain 2 measures of seed. Next he put the wood in order, cut the bull in pieces, and laid it on the wood. He said, Fill 4 jars with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood. Then he said, Do it a second time. And they did it a second time. Again he said, Do it a third time. And they did it a third time, so that the water ran all around the altar and filled the trench also with water. At the time of the offering of the oblation, the prophet Elijah came near and said, O Lord, God of Israel, Isaac and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your bidding. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, so that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, and the dust, and even licked up the water that was in the trench. When all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, The Lord indeed is God, the Lord indeed is God.
You know how they say that if you don't like the weather in the Ozarks, just wait a day and it will change? Well, we learned that pretty quickly when we first moved to Springfield. That day in July of 1998, when we drove up to our rental home with all our worldly belongings in a truck, it was over 100 degrees. We wondered just what we had gotten ourselves into. And then we had a rather stormy September. And we discovered that, there were exceptions, and yes, it would change. In the fall of that year, we purchased our home and moved in on a very unseasonably warm Thanksgiving weekend. We hoped for some snow for Christmas, but that didn't materialize. But on New Year's Day of 1999, we experienced our first ice storm. Not the big one, that would come 8 years later. In the afternoon of that day, it began to sleet, and by evening, it had piled up quite a bit, and the gutters were frozen over. I was out trying to sweep water away from the front door, ice water, by the way, and our neighbor from across the street yelled over and said, "Do you have heat in case the power goes off?" What? You mean the power could go off in all this? And we remembered that somewhere in the back corner of the yard, there was a wood pile. So about midnight that night, we were out there with flashlights and umbrellas, trying to chip away the ice from the wood to see if we could find some firewood for the fireplace. It was soaked. There was no way that wood was going to burn. Well, fortunately, the power stayed on. We weathered that storm and eventually got that wood pile dried out and covered in time for the next big ice storm when the power did go off. Now, you may be wondering just what that has to do with Elijah and the prophets of Baal, right? Well, stay tuned. The story from 1 Kings today actually picks up in the midst of a drought and resulting severe famine in Samaria. It was during the reign of King Ahab, who had married Jezebel, who was a worshiper of Baal. Now, let me say a word about that name. The proper pronunciation in Hebrew, as I learned from my Old Testament professor in seminary, is Baal. but almost everyone pronounces it Baal, so it shall be today. Sorry, Dr. Ballantyne. Baal was the Canaanite fertility god who was the god of rain, thunder, and lightning. Jezebel had convinced Ahab to worship Baal in addition to Yahweh. In response, Yahweh, the true God of Israel, had closed up the skies so there would be no rain, which meant there would be no fertility in the land. God had commissioned the prophet Elijah to announce this drought to the king. Lucky him, right? And ever since, Ahab and Jezebel had been searching for him. And you can figure out why. For 3 long years, not a single drop of rain had fallen in the land. People were hungry, and the royal animals were in danger of starving to death. So Ahab took Obadiah, one of his palace officials, to help him find somewhere for the animals to graze. It doesn't say whether he was concerned about the people starving or not. In order to cover more ground, they split up. While they were searching, Obadiah happened to meet Elijah on his way to Samaria, where the Lord had sent him to find Ahab and announce that the Lord would end the drought. Now, unbeknownst to Ahab, Obadiah was secretly a devout believer in the God of Israel and had risked his life to hide 100 of the Lord's prophets from Jezebel, who, in retaliation for the drought, intended to kill them. Are you with me so far? This is kind of a complicated story. So Obadiah went off to find the king and arranged the meeting between him and Elijah. Surely Ahab wanted to kill Elijah on the spot, but he knew the prophet was his only hope for ending the drought. So he listened as Elijah told him to send a proclamation throughout Israel and assemble the people on Mount Carmel, specifically including the 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Baal's female counterpart, Asherah. The showdown was set. Once they were gathered, Elijah first addressed the people. He had noticed their allegiance to the God of Israel was wavering, and he accused them of limping with 2 different opinions. Apparently, Jezebel had been successful in turning some of them to Baal, and Elijah was calling them on it. If the Lord is God, follow God. If Baal is God, follow Baal. In other words, choose. Now, we already know from the commandments in Exodus that Yahweh was a jealous God and did not want to be one among many. But the people were silent. And so Elijah proceeded to prove to them who was their true God. Now, there were 2 altars on Mount Carmel. The altar of Baal was well used and in good condition, but the altar of the Lord was in ruins, perhaps further attesting that the people had all but abandoned Yahweh. So Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal to a contest. Each side would choose a bull for an offering, lay it on the wood on the altar, and ask their God to send down fire to consume the offering. Now, right away, we notice that the deck is stacked against Elijah. First, they are on Mount Carmel, which was believed to be the sacred dwelling place of Baal. Second, As the lone prophet of Yahweh, he was outnumbered 850 to 1 by the prophets of Baal and Asherah. Well, make that 852 to 1, because remember, Ahab and Jezebel didn't think much of him either. Third, Baal is the storm god. If he can do anything at all, it would be to throw down lightning and start a fire. And fourth, the prophets of Baal get to go first. And if the altar fire is lit, the contest is over, and Yahweh doesn't even get a chance. So the prophets of Baal prepare their bull and place it on the altar. They pray, they dance, they limp around the altar. They even cut themselves with swords and lances, which harkens back to a myth in which Baal is swallowed by Mot, the god of death. And the god El cuts himself in mourning. Elijah ridicules their efforts and mocks their God, and still they continue their antics for hours. But there is no response. Finally, it is God's turn. Elijah calmly steps forward, calls the people to come closer, rebuilds the altar of Yahweh, and prepares the bull. But Elijah does something more. He ups the ante by having the altar flooded with water not once, but 3 times. There's that number 3 again. Now I have to wonder, if there was such a severe drought in the land, where did all that water come from? And here's where that wet wood comes back into the picture. There is no chance that wood could burn. But at this point in the story, you just know it's going to, don't you? And nonetheless, Elijah prays and asks God to answer him so that the hearts of the people may be turned back. Elijah acknowledges that he alone cannot make that happen. And in response, immediately God sends fire from heaven that consumes not only the offering, but the wood, the stones, the dust, and even the water, leaving no doubt as to who is the true God of Israel. And the people respond, "The Lord indeed is God." Now that's a pretty fantastic story, isn't it? It's one of those miraculous stories in the Hebrew Bible in which the point is not necessarily historical accuracy, but instead the revelation of who God is. And one issue is allegiance and obedience to the first commandment: "You shall have no other gods before me." You know, it's easy for us to condemn the Israelites for not loving God with all their hearts. But like them, we sometimes limp between 2 or more different opinions. In our multicultural post-Christian world, it is easy to get distracted. Today, our allegiance is too easily divided between our Creator God and other gods, not necessarily flesh and blood, although they can be. They can also be made of paper, usually green in color, or a variety of metals and other materials that we turn into cars and technological stuff. Sometimes we find ourselves bowing at the altars of materialism or entertainment or self. Our youth, and indeed many of us, have grown up idolizing sports heroes, music legends, and movie stars. In fact, I was named after one. So yes, there is much to pull us away from our God. And if we listen closely to this story, we may find that Elijah's words are not only for the Israelites, but also for us. I suspect that if I ask you today the question that Elijah asked the people on Mount Carmel, how long will you go limping with two different opinions? I would get the same answer, not a word. But let us listen and heed his words. If the Lord is God, follow God, so that we may stop limping and our hearts may be turned back. Amen.